All right, this is the fourth section of Module 11, the Heirs of Rome, and here we're going to take a closer look at the Carolingian dynasty, in particular focus on the most famous of all the Carolingian kings, a man named Charles the Great, or to say his name the French way, Charlemagne. The previous lesson we looked at how Pepin the Short was crowned king of the Franks. When Pepin dies, he divides his kingdom among his two surviving sons, Charlemagne and Charles. But Charlemagne dies in 770 and leaves Charles as the sole king of the Franks. Charles is going to have two main goals. First off, he wants to unite all the Germanic peoples into one kingdom, and he wants to expand his rule on not just over the Franks, but over all other Germanic people as well. And secondly, he wants to convert all the Franks and any of the people he conquers to Christianity. So that these are going to be the two primary goals. Because Charles is so successful at achieving these goals, he's given the title Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, if you like to say it in French. Now, Charlemagne embarks on a series of military campaigns. He's very successful in expanding his kingdom. He conquers the Lombards in Italy. He's also very successful in his fights against the Saxons, up here in what is modern-day Germany, where his victories over the Germanic groups, he unites them into the Frankish kingdom. Not only that, but he conquers these areas. He's forcing the conquered people to convert to Christianity. In the process of all his military conquests, Charlemagne will create the largest empire in Europe since the fall of Rome. The only two areas that he lacked to match the size of the western part of the empire are the areas of Britain and Spain. Now, Charlemagne is making his military conquest. He is said to also force people that he conquers to convert to Christianity. And granted, he is not making converts the way I would suggest you do that, right? Where Christians go about making converts by basically telling people, about the gospel message, he's saying you need to convert or be killed. But once he conquers an area, he sends in monks and priests, and they're going to set up monasteries and churches, and they're actually going to instruct the people to try and explain what this Christianity is and have people agree to follow it. So we're seeing that Charlemagne is working quite closely with the church, and he continues to enjoy a close relationship with the papacy. So the Pope at the time is a man named Leo III, and he gets into, a little bit of trouble in Rome. He alienates some people living there, and they get very upset with the Pope, and they basically start chasing after the Pope to try and capture him. They want to cut off his tongue and kill him, so the Pope is running scared. When Charlemagne hears that the Pope is in trouble, he takes military troops and goes and finds the Pope, protects him, brings him back to Rome, reestablishes order, and tells the people of the Rome that they can't hurt Pope Leo. He's so impressed with Charlemagne's actions, and he's very appreciative of them. So on Christmas Day, when the Pope is celebrating Mass in Rome in the year 800, at the end of Mass, he invites Charlemagne to come down to the front of the church, and in front of everybody, the Pope crowns Charlemagne, giving him the titles of Emperor and Augustus. Now, hopefully these titles sound familiar because they're the same titles that would have been used by Roman emperors. So he's giving these titles to Charlemagne. And the Pope is in essence saying that Charlemagne is the next emperor of Rome, but that he's a new kind of Roman emperor. And if you'll remember, we said one of the themes that we can find throughout medieval history is this desire to go back to the glory days of Rome. And so politically here, the Pope is trying to go back to the glory days when the Roman emperors were in charge. Now, Charlemagne seems to have been a little bit upset by his coronation. I don't think that he minded the fact that he was given the lofty titles, but he probably resented a little bit that it was done by the Pope, which made it look like he was kind of subservient to the Pope. However, we can say that when it comes to ruling his kingdom that he had built, Charlemagne cannot really rule all of that large territory by himself. So what he does to help him rule is he divides the territory up into regions, and he appoints a government official called a count to be in charge of these different regions. And these areas that they are put in charge of become known as counties. And if you live in any other state other than Louisiana, they're all divided up into counties, and that's where this kind of comes from. So for the purpose of a count was, to enforce Charlemagne's rules in their particular county. So they would be responsible for recruiting men into the military. There would be some tax collection. They would administer justice to make sure that Charlemagne's orders are carried out within their county. Now, Charlemagne realized that this would help him rule effectively, but he wasn't entirely sure that he could trust all the counts to do the things the way he wanted them to. So Charlemagne also created another government position, and these people were known as the Missi Dominici, which is a Latin phrase which means royal messengers. Literally, it means the messengers of the ward. And I would say for the purposes of this class, you need to know that the Missi Dominici were really royal messengers that Charlemagne would send out through the kingdom, and their task was, as their name suggests, to deliver messages to the counts from Charlemagne. They would serve another important role because when the Missi Dominici show up, they usually send them out in pairs. They would show up, they would give Charlemagne messages to the counts, and they would usually stick around and make sure that the count was carrying out the orders and that he was running the county effectively. And then they would write reports back to Charlemagne, letting him know if the count was fulfilling his duties or not. And if they wrote back to Charlemagne and said this guy wasn't doing what he was supposed to, that would usually prompt Charlemagne to go out and usually take a small military force to meet the count to see if they would iron out the differences. And of course, if the count was unwilling to fall in line, Charlemagne would usually fight them to remove them from power. But we can see here now Charlemagne is attempting to run a large empire in a large kingdom. He is somewhat successful. There are some administrative issues with the system that he set up. It's definitely not foolproof, but we're seeing him try to restore political stability to Western Europe. Charlemagne gets the title of not only for his amazing accomplishments, but also for the economic and cultural accomplishments as well. These latter two accomplishments are pulled together in what some historians have called the Carolingian revival. Some historians will actually use the term Carolingian Renaissance, meaning rebirth, but I like the term revival. So the two things that we see revived by Charlemagne are the revival of trade and the revival of learning. Now, when Charlemagne is crowned emperor, he starts opening up diplomatic ties to other empires, mainly the Byzantines and the Islamic Empire. Together with the renewal of diplomacy, we see the renewal of trade between these areas. And while it's not a great deal of trade because it's difficult to trade over long distances, we are seeing some limited trade open up between Charlemagne's kingdom and the Byzantines and Muslims in the Islamic Empire. With Charlemagne's kingdom, we are also seeing this revival of trade by him expanding his kingdom. Charlemagne has brought political stability as well, and so this means that people can move from town to town, engage in trading ventures relatively safely. So we see Charlemagne is also minting coins. He's encouraging the revival of trade within his kingdom, bring about a measure of economic prosperity. He's also very interested in learning. One of my favorite stories about Charlemagne is that, in his later years, Charlemagne tries to learn how to read and write, and he keeps this wax tablet beside his bed, and every night before bed, he would practice his letters on this wax tablet in trying to learn how to form the letters. And it seems kind of, just funny that, you have this amazing warrior who's taking such an interest in learning and education. But he ends up meeting a British monk named Alcuin of York, and he invites Alcuin to set up an educational system for the Carolingian Empire. And what Alcuin does is he establishes the 7 liberal arts as the foundation for education within Charlemagne's kingdom. Now, if you're embarking upon the study of the liberal arts during the Middle Ages, it would look quite differently from the liberal arts education that you're getting today. In the Middle Ages, you would start off by studying the trivium, which were the 3 basic subjects you would start by learning, grammar. In Latin, you would study rhetoric, the art of speaking, and you would study logic, the art of thinking. And once you're proficient in those subjects, you would continue your education on the quadrivium, or the remaining 4 subjects, which included geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. And so this was an educational curriculum that Alcuin sets up, and Alcuin uses this system of schools known as cathedral schools because schooling was very closely tied to the church. So in the areas that were able to have major cathedrals, this meant you had a lot of priests, and they tended to be the most well-educated of these. Cathedral schools, they're really church schools that are teaching. And the schools in the liberal arts curriculum, most of these individuals within Charlemagne's kingdom would not be able to go to school, and this was because in order to go to the cathedral school, you had to have leisure time that you could engage in education. And most common people, had children. They would need their children to be out working to support the family, and they would not be able to afford to have a child to go off to school. Family income would suffer because of that. So we find that education is kind of restricted to the middle and upper classes who are able to afford time away for their children to engage in learning instead of, earning income. The other thing I would say about this education is really for men only. We do have some girls going to these cathedral schools, but not many at all, very, very few. The final thing that Alcuin does is, addition to setting up liberal arts curriculum at the cathedral schools, is he also creates a new style of writing. This is called Carolingian minuscule, which is both upper and lowercase letters, and punctuation. Prior to this, the way that most writing was done was in all capital letters with no spaces between the words, and you can imagine that would be pretty challenging to read. So with all these advances in education, what Charlemagne does accomplish is he's pulling Western Europe out of the Dark Ages. And we're seeing not just a return to political stability and economic prosperity, but we're seeing a revival of learning and an end to the Dark Ages in Europe. Now, we've been using the metaphor to think about the Middle Ages, the metaphor of a roller coaster. And we can see Charlemagne's reign is a high point, and they've climbed up on this roller coaster. Unfortunately for the people of Western Europe, they don't really stay at that high point. And so what we see happening after Charlemagne's death is, once again, we're going to see this roller coaster kind of plunging down and people screaming in terror. And it comes out of some of these political things that happen after he dies. After Charlemagne dies, he has one surviving son he's able to pass down this kingdom to. But that son has several sons, and Charlemagne has 3 grandsons. And so following traditional Germanic practices of inheritance, Charlemagne's kingdom ends up getting divided amongst the 3 grandsons in the Treaty of Verdun, which is basically a significant treaty because what it's doing is splitting up Charlemagne's kingdom among his 3 grandsons. And you can see here on the map that the largest state that has been put together since Western Europe, or Western Roman Empire, and instead it's going to be divided up into 3 kingdoms. So you have Charles, who gets here. Part of this is largely France. You have his brother Louis, who is getting an area that's largely modern-day Germany. And his eldest son, Lothair, is not only getting the titles Emperors and Augustus, but he's getting this middle territory, which includes parts of France and Germany, and also parts of Italy. It's splitting up the kingdom weakens the kingdom, and it's going to make this kingdom, these 3 kingdoms, more vulnerable to outside attacks. And we see that this political legacy is going to be interconnected with economic legacy. And so Charlemagne's revival of trade, that it helped bring back some of this prosperity to Western Europe, is going to be very attractive to the Vikings. And since the kingdom has now been divided into 3 separate kingdoms, that makes them more vulnerable to attack by the Vikings. However, there is some long-term positive outcomes for Charlemagne's reign, and that's his cultural legacy. So by creating this school system, bring back the revival of learning, Charlemagne has pulled Europe out of the Dark Ages, and he's laying the foundation for medieval universities that are going to develop in the High Middle Ages. And so we can see that even though Charlemagne's reign does not end, with everlasting prosperity and stability, he certainly laid the foundations for a return to stability and prosperity by the time we get to the High Middle Ages. But before we get there, we're going to have to look at the last group that we consider the heirs of Rome, and they threaten what Charlemagne has done, and that is going to be the Vikings.